I was born in Portsmouth, Virginia, 1931, during the Great Depression, one of the worst ones to hit the United States of America. Everybody lost money. Millionaires were paupers the next day. And my mother was saying that they were jumping out of buildings. They just could not stand being poor. I don't know how many millionaires killed themselves. And there were bread lines, and there were soup kitchens. And this was, I was born in 1931, right before the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And he is the only president in our history that ever served 4 terms. So that brought him right into World War II. But I mean, that he was our president then. And I saw him in person. He was had polio when he was a young man, but he was so afraid if anybody saw him with crutches or anything. At that time, they were so picky. He was coming. It was doing. Oh, the war had started. Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. Let's see, I think I was 8 years old, and he came to see the huge, at that time it had, where they build the ships in Portsmouth, the Norfolk Naval Shipyard. And that shipyard, during the time of right after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, it completely changed. It filled up workers. It was a time of change when I was a little girl. They went to people, especially mothers, that were stay-at-home moms, and they went and were working in the factories to loosen the factory workers to join up. They had the draft. You had to go and serve your country. And my first recollection of what a war was, a world war. Everybody was fighting. South America, China, Japanese, Russia, the whole world was inflamed, so to speak. So I would say my childhood was I was a child of the Great Depression, and I lived through World War II. And Aaron, we had victory gardens that people would, because there was no fruit or anything, we were encouraged to plant tomatoes and beans and things that we could cook at home. There was a rationing of coffee, sugar, and we had food stamps. And if you had so many children, you got so many food stamps. My mother had, mother and daddy had 4. So you would get 1 pound of coffee to last 2 weeks. But that was the biggie then, was drinking coffee. Mm-hmm. Your grandfather was already in the service. And Grandpa Edward Ullum, when I was a little girl, we all sat around the radio. There was no TV. And you would hear, it's a big Navy area down there, all soldiers, all sailors report to Fort. All soldiers report to Fort Story within 3 hours. Immediate emergency. Then it would be all sailors of the USS Dewey report for duty on Pier 14 at the Norfolk Naval Shipyard. This was going on because armada of ships. I gotta say that for our country, they mobilized like nobody else had, and even children your age and my age were, as a young girl, were doing everything they could because it was a dirty thing that happened to America in Hawaii. And the Japanese ambassador was in Washington talking peace, wanted to sign a peace treaty on the morning of December 7th when the Japanese, everybody was sleeping, Oahu and the they didn't have radar very good then, but they had something, and the men on duty, the sailors on duty, said that looked like a group of planes heading for Hawaii, and and they didn't have no record of any of them that was supposed to come in, and so they called the commandant. Oh, pretty black cat chickadees.
Shoot, Jen.
So, and there was news of the people in Hawaii saw this contingent of Japanese airplanes, and they were easy to spot because they had the rising sun as a symbol on the underside of the wings, and all of a sudden, hell broke loose. The Arizona went down, the Missouri went down. A lot of they destroyed our airplanes that were over there, even though some very brave soldiers and sailors tried to get in their planes and take off, but they knew just what they wanted to get. Aaron. So I was about 8 or 9 years old, probably maybe 7 when it started. And until I graduated from high school, everything was WW2. And this is the era that I grew up in, Grandpa grew up in, because I was 16 when I graduated from high school. And the war ended in Armistice Day is World War One. But World War Two, it ended in June, I think, of 1945. So 41, 4 years that war lasted, and they had so many atrocities. The Bataan March. World War Two now is getting to me like the Civil War was to me when I was a young girl. So, the one thing about World War II that they say that they were uh, brave Americans. They came home from war and never spoke about it. I didn't know all the things that happened to my father until Uncle Eddie, who is really keen on this kind of stuff, started to tell me that they were after the U-boats crossing the Atlantic, and they were really, I don't know how many tons of boats and stuff went down to that terrible grave by the U-boats
Mhm.
until President Roosevelt declared war on Hitler. That it was a change in America's being stay out of stuff.
Right.
Now, as far as my background goes, I graduated from school. I was 16 in February, and we were out of school at 16. I can't believe it. But that was a big change in America just about that time. And they would let the kids stop at 8th grade. There was no middle school. And Aaron, I got my first job after graduation in the Bank of Virginia, and I was scared to death. That's what they told me later. I had never worked but at the drugstore. All of them, all Mike and everybody worked at the drugstore from Butsy, Mr. Butt, Budd. But that takes me up to 47 and 1947. How much more do they want? All the way. How much time you got? The racism when I grew up, Aaron, was terrible. And they had so many Jim Crow laws and blue laws, which they closed everything down on Sunday. Virginia was right at the top of the list of being a nasty state for black people to live, and it got worse the further south you went. I remember seeing restrooms colored only, white only, and the bus that Rosa Parks got on were buses that were all over the South. There was a big yellow line on the floor of the bus. You entered the front of the bus and put your dime in or whatever, and whether there was any room in the front of the bus, those poor people had to go in the back of the bus. And I remember, there were some nasty bus drivers who used to scare me to death. They'd stop and say, "Get your ass back there. Hey, Blackie, get your ass back there." And I was kind of a scare baby in that age group. And there would be some grumbling and hatred, but they would get up and go in the back. Rosa Parks had such a terrible day. It was in the 60s when the race riots, and we lived in Washington, D.C. Stopped the bus, and that was what I just told you.
Right.
And I guess I was about 16 years old because I was out of school, and 17. And they were instances that were starting up, and unfortunately your great uncle, grandpa's brother, was James, and he was a policeman. And I remember him coming in and talking in the kitchen, saying we used to call the black men burrheads because nobody had an afro.
Yeah.
Everybody was real sharp, and they got natural curly hair. And we got one burrhead, he said, in the back seat, and they would go like this, if they wanted to give him a hard time so there'd be no marks on his face. I listened to that, and I swear to God, I used to think that's awful. but they had, um, that was just the way it was. They couldn't sit Woolworths or Kresge's. They had a special section for them to eat lunch, even if this whole section was empty. And that was just a problem waiting to explode. And explode it did, Aaron. But um, that was the era I grew up in. And they were, uh, they used to call it nigger town. I think that's an awful word. You belong over nigger town if they saw a black man or woman, unless she was working as a kitchen worker or
How you doing, dear?
just fine. All right, here's the big test, Miss Judy.
Let's see how good Mom's memory is. She's pretty good, isn't she, Aaron?
They were dark days, like an explosion waiting to happen, because you could see in the eyes of the black people towards other people. But you know, I gotta say this for your great grandma Josephine. She was Joe too. She would say, you treat people nice, they treat you nice. And all the we lived on 4th Street, which was the main street out of the big Navy Yard. And when the whistle blew, the whistle blows. That's the way they told the workers it was time to get out of there and go home. You could hear that whistle all over town. It was one of the whistles, a steam whistle that, and everybody listened to that. And here they all come with their lunch boxes. And you see right now pictures of the workers piling out of those type of, they were building ships where I live. A lot of them were building airplanes all through the country. And a lot of the women had the opportunity then to go into the factories or the shipyards and everything for relieving a man to go into the service. And they had recruiting all over, Aaron. And one of the things I thought was so interesting, we had blackout curtains. As you know, that when you light a light you can see it for miles. And they found Nazi U-boats off of the Virginia coast. And they were fighting, dropping bombs. It was 12 miles out to sea. Used to be a 6-mile limit. Off the coast of Virginia, but during the war, the United States put it out to 12 miles so they could make sure who was using those waters. And if they had sirens just like we do now for tornadoes, and if there were the U-boats spotted off of Norfolk, these big sirens would go off and everybody had to go in their house, and it was black, especially if the moon wasn't light then. And the wardens, my aunt was an air raid warden, they had authority to call the police or arrest anybody that they thought a light, they didn't have these black curtains to pull down. So that was kind of a scary time to to grow up in, Aaron. It wasn't a time when there was a real fear like terrorism. They didn't call it terrorism because you could tell the difference in the Japanese. The Italians were against us, Mussolini. You could tell the difference in the uniforms, who was the good guys, and so forth and so on. So, yeah, what are these?
Toffee. They're cookies. What are they? The toffee chip cookies.
Wonderful.
All right. So when did you meet? When did you meet Grandpa? And you can kind of summarize from.
To summarize, this will take us right into the early 50s.
Yep.
I had some interesting jobs, and
Such as.
I was a receptionist at the bank, and they wouldn't pay me enough. So a girlfriend of mine saying, "Why don't you come work for the Coast Guard over in Norfolk?" So I had to take the ferry boat to Norfolk for 10 cents, and then we walked everywhere. And Aaron, that was the most fun. You sit on the ferry boat and you would walk everywhere and catch the bus home. The thing that I enjoyed that job because the Coast Guard was taking care of all the lighthouses, and they still have that job today. And the Coast Guard would so I worked in their main office. Then I was a GS2. They had an opening at the U.S. Naval Hospital, and I got a notice from the government, if I wanted to take the test for this medical secretary. And I didn't think I had a chance, but I did, and I passed it pretty good. And I was real good typist. I was a real good, a stenographer. I used to take shorthand. And so I got that job and went over to the Naval Hospital. And I was working in the personnel office. And for Mrs. Litchfield, Mrs. Don't let me forget her name, Lord. She just was such a nice lady. She just loved Harry. But that's where I went to work. And I remember the day Grandpa Harry had just come in on that campus of the oldest U.S. Naval Hospital in the nation. They had a big class of hospital corpsmen, and they would work on the wards. So, the war had ended in 1945, and the Korean War started up. And that's where Grandpa got, he was involved in the Korean War, and so was Uncle Eddie. But I was glad that, and by that time I was worked on the hospital committee for entertainment, and so they had a big Summers Inn at the auditorium, and myself with a bunch of other women, we set up tables and put tablecloths on them, and the Navy band was gonna play, and it was open, and they served hot dogs and hamburgers, still that same old crap. Even then, Aaron, and I knew Harry from the office, and he came over and asked me to dance. And I loved to dance. I wasn't the old rickety person now, because Uncle Mike and I won the Virginia Beach dance contest. I was good, and so was Uncle Mike before he became a prick. And Harry came over. He said, Joe, would you like to dance? And would you believe they had dance cards? Dance cards was
No, Ginger. No.
a card shoulder you had around here, and the card was about this big, and you would say,
Ginger.
Aaron.
Ginger.
She get off.
Grandma
It's
Jen.
not for you.
Push her over there.
Ginger. No.
All gone. She's too smart though.
Nope. She fell for it.
I don't want to look at her. She can see my guilty face. And Grandpa asked me to dance. And I saw him in the office, and he was thin and lanky like you are. Grandpa was really thin. So he said, do you have a steady boyfriend? At that time, I didn't tell him I had broken up with somebody else I was engaged to. I said, no, I don't, Harry. And he said, well, my friend, and I know, I can't think of his name now. Would you like to go out? Would you believe a spaghetti dinner? I said, I grew up on spaghetti. He said, I love that. My mother never cooked that. Isn't that sweet? And Aaron, one thing that impressed me about Grandpa, he was Minnesota nice. He really was. And then, we started dating a little bit. And where's my cookie? And around the U.S. Naval Hospital, I'll tell you this, and I'll let you go lay down.
What?
The U.S. Naval Hospital in Portsmouth, Virginia. It is the oldest naval hospital in the nation because it was built during the Civil War. And because from here to those row of pine trees was the James River, named after
King James.
Elizabeth, Queen Elizabeth's paramour,
That's a big word.
her boyfriend.
Ah.
And she couldn't marry him. She loved him, but he wasn't of royal blood. Would you get?
No.
It's a little piece, Judy. Ain't gonna hurt her.
So back to Grandpa being Minnesota nice.
He was just precious, like he was when you met him. And I gotta say that about Daddy. Okay, goodbye. All going. But one time, this is fate. I was working, and I had to work late. So he said, I'll meet you at the bus came right in the Naval Hospital. It wasn't a time when you were accosted or anything. So I said, well, I'll wait for you at the bus stop in the Naval Hospital. He said, well, we'll go to a movie. and he never showed up. Nobody had cell phones in them days. So I had to go in the chaplain's office, and I had the phone number to his where they slept in the back, what do they call them, barracks. No, Harry's not here. I said, I thought to myself, he's not the kind that would stand a person up. But since I broke up with Arthur Boulay, who was the founder of the Frogmen, which are now the SEALs. You know what the Navy SEALs are?
Yeah, no, I'm just trying to what's the word? Process that you dated the head of the Navy SEALs.
Well, he was just a lieutenant then.
All right. I'm like, whoa, hold on a sec.
You, I had some cute boys after me, Aaron.
Oh God.
I don't want you to go tell everybody.
Those service boys.
I mean, that was a big service town. They had a USO there, and you needed volunteers for the USO, and they had open houses on the big ships and everything, and a group of us girls would go and check them out. And if they wanted to ask me out, they had to come and see Grandma Ullum and Grandpa Ullum, and they were real strict. And nobody moved out into an apartment in those days. And I think your mother will
Did
birth
Harry have to ask your mom and dad?
for my hand and marry.
No, I mean just to date you.
I brought him home. I had him come pick me up, and Daddy, I can see him now. And he had a chair like that, and he said, "When's this guy coming over?" I said, "Well, he said he would be here at 6, Dad. We're going to a movie." But wait a minute. Harry didn't show. So I called, asked the chaplain, which I knew very well because I worked it and helped clean the chapel on the base. Me and a couple other girls, and he said, "Joe, drop him. Once they start that, you don't need that." He said, "Go on home. If I see him, I'll tell him to go home." Well, Harry, I was waiting for the bus from here to that white building there where the chapel was, and I heard pitter patter of feet running. He said, "Oh God, Joe, you're still here." He said, "I fell asleep. I had to do watch last night, and I just zonked out." He said somebody else's clock went off, and that woke me up. He really apologized. I was saying, "Kiss my feet." But I could tell he was sincere. And the rest is history. But we used to, what they don't use today, and men and women miss out on that courting. And that is like a character building. Harry had to pick me up in the house. There was no beep beep and a person runs out to the
Or text you here and you run off.
yeah, nope. That was the old way. And I think I've met some wonderful young people lately that I'm encouraged by a lot of them. You know, they always put the notorious ones on what they do, but everybody is a teen, like Aaron and little Jonathan, Johnny, and so forth and so on. And there's nothing wrong with that. First thing that I thought was interesting, I got married in 1952. And Mike was born in 53. And they were, the Korean War lost so many people, Aaron. 55,000 men and nurses and so forth. I had an opportunity to go to Guantanamo Bay for 2 years. And while we were there, the head of the country was President Batista. And because that's some of the deepest harbor waters in the world at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba signed a treaty with the United States in perpetuity that they can always have that area called Guantanamo Bay forever. Now, this is when the United States and Cuba were wonderful allies. The United States, during the turn of the century, freed the people of Cuba from the Spanish that had taken over their country. And the Spanish-American War was a result of it. And that was at the turn of the century.
Aaron, she's still going on.
Yep.
Holy shit, I'm sorry. Back one. Wake you up.
Poor Aaron.
Hi, G.
But I will say that this is the first, I got so many historical things since we lived in Washington doing the Million Man March, was you could see from the Quonset huts we lived in, look across that bay. Grandpa was stationed at the naval, he was stationed at the air station, and they made runs when pilots would ditch into this to pick them up on the Bay of Guantanamo. And for some reason, planes were not that reliable at that time. They had propellers. And you could see Castro setting fires to the sugarcane fields. And they broke into the ammunition depot, and everybody was warned not to go off base. Yeah, you're probably sick of it, Aaron.
No, I'm telling him to be quiet because this is interesting.
Well, I said, we went to off base. I just had Mike and Bobby then, and you had to wear your uniform. And we went the first place and the only place we could go, because Guantanamo is at the southeast corner of the island. And for the minute you got off base, you knew you were in a foreign country. When we got to Santiago, it was like a war zone. They were checking, made you get out, and they checked the car because they were looking for the rebels that Castro was a part of. And he was just a young man, him and his brother Raul. But we had to all get out and show your papers, and scared the bejesus out of me. They all had machine guns, and they would stick those machine guns into the windows. Get out, McConnell, get out. And this was Batista's supposed to be friends with the United States, but he didn't trust nobody. And that was the very first historical thing, was when Fidel Castro was trying to overthrow the government of Cuba. One of the most significant ones when Grandpa was stationed at the Capitol was when man landed on the moon. That well, Jonathan, I'm not sure you were born then.
JFK was shot.
Huh?
JFK was shot.
Was yeah. John F. Kennedy was assassinated when we were in Washington D.C. and Grandpa was everything was alerted. Grandpa was at the Capitol working, and at midnight he came home and he said, "Joe, get the kids up." The sergeant of arms said that I could bring y'all in the back way and show you where President Kennedy was laying on the catapult that had held Abraham Lincoln. And we got there, Aaron, just when Jackie, Bobby Kennedy, Ethel Bobby's wife, and little John, and Caroline were there. I had a perfect picture of them. And the line around the Capitol building, they were going to close at midnight. There were people everywhere, everywhere. And they had to keep the Capitol open all night. And that was on my mind for the longest time because I really enjoyed President Kennedy. Was young, had a little family, and it was cowardly the way someone killed him and shot him in the head. That was sad days. It really was. And then it wasn't long before Bobby Kennedy was going to run for president, and he got assassinated in a hotel.
Mm-hmm.
Sirhan was the assassin that killed him. And then, by God, Martin Luther King was killed. And that's when the blacks rioted all through, mostly in Washington D.C., and that was another baddie. He was Martin Luther was in, I'm not sure, he was in Tennessee somewhere. I'll like to say Nashville, but I'm not sure. And nobody saw who shot him, but whoever killed him right away. They did arrest a couple years later somebody that supposedly confessed to doing this awful deed, but that was terrible. Enough people couldn't believe it. They lost Jack, Bobby, and John. Let's see, John, Bobby, and Mark. What is the name of Mark? Yeah, and Martin.
Martin Luther King.
Johnny Cash had a wonderful song like that. And they had a terrible eruption of protesting with the African American people going bananas in Washington, D.C. We were all on curfew. We could not, nobody was going to be walking the streets at night near the Capitol. We lived just over the block. There was Washington, D.C., and this side was Maryland. And they were just absolute. I remember Grandpa coming home and he said, I never thought I'd see the day that there would be machine guns on the Capitol steps. He said it just breaks our heart. When you went to get gas, because they called out the National Guard because they were afraid there was a lot of rioting and looting and all of this stuff. And that made an impression on me that I didn't like to feel in my country. They were suspicious of each other and so forth and so on. Look at her. She's looking for a crumb. And there's other spots, like I say, I was in Washington when man landed on the moon, Aaron. You have no idea. People came out in the streets, and it was just like I just nobody could believe it. What a tremendous feat that was. The closest person I got was to Richard Nixon, and I attended his inauguration. And Grandpa attended Nixon's inauguration. He had to carry they had because he was in the medical field, he carried the admiral's suitcase. I mean, where he had all of his stuff to save, what you call it.
Medical supplies.
Medical supplies. I went every place when I was in Washington, D.C., except when people came over and wanted to see the White House. I had to babysit the kids because I never did get to the White House, except outside the gate. Because there was so many people that came to see us in the beginning, and they had a place to rest, you know. So Grandpa and I got kicked out of our bedroom. Grandma, my mother and daddy came. Uncle Eddie and his 4 children came, and Grandpa Capanos and so forth. But I just can't remember a lot of things but I do remember those things. The killing of John F. Kennedy and his all that nonsense that happened after he was shot. Nobody could believe it. Do you remember any of that, Judy? Or you can't have been very old. 1964.
She was 2.
Yeah. I remembered Aaron when they broke in to Watergate. Nixon was the president. Chuck Colson, I think he resigned. He was the first president to resign. And Gerald Ford, and Grandpa knew him very well, was the vice president. And it was in the late 60s or 70s, and we had just left Washington, D.C. And when we went back to see Washington, D.C., I could not believe the changes since 9/11 when Bobby and I went. Washington is hilly, just like this city. Since the of 30s and 40s, life now is more filled with electronics. In some ways, it's much easier. More communications via all these things that we've got to work with now, and it's completely changed. Um, People are living longer. I don't think the world is as safe as it was when I was a little girl, by virtue of the fact of during World War II, they knew who the enemy was. Now it's hard to know the enemy because they could be your neighbor right across the street. But you see somebody in a Nazi uniform or so forth and so on, you know. That was the consequences of, I think life passes by quicker now than when I was a little girl. It was a lot slower. More education for women, freedom for the civil rights people. They're living longer. As for the opposite, Aaron, as for the opposite of living when I was in a different era, was I don't want to say the quality of people. It's just just like Bo.
In and out.
We had it down the door.
Yeah, and it is. It's not as trusting as when I grew up, and I don't. I think eventually we'll go back to the basics, but I think life moves so much quicker now. Don't you even find that, Judy?
What's that?
Quicker. I think life moves quicker now for young. You know, it's just a different time.
Mhm.
A different time, and I don't think we'll ever go back to the way it used to be.
Mm-mm.
My mama used to go to the grocery store and give me a little list, and Mr. Levine would put 1 gallon, we didn't have gallons, we just had quarts, 2 quarts of milk, so forth, and add it up and gave me a copy. And I'd say, Mama said she paid something on her bill Friday, which was payday.
What life lessons would you like to pass on?
Never give up. Never give up. Please keep a sense of humor. Just because you get older doesn't mean you have to be a
Prick.
Grandma will haunt you.
You're already haunting me.
but that's true. You know, old people think they got, some of them got the privilege of fussing at people, and they don't want young people around. I think young people are fun. I know this might sound corny, but love. Don't get to tell the people that how much you love them, because you never know. And that might sound corny, but when you get to be almost 83, that is very important. You know, go to work and think somebody's going to be home and they're not. So, and smell the flowers. And you always stay as nice as you are today.